Did you know that the book of Genesis contains a puzzle that most readers pass by without stopping? The first chapter says that God created man and woman simultaneously. The second chapter tells a different story. God created woman later from the rib of the sleeping man. Two accounts of the same event, and between them, an obvious contradiction. Who was that woman from the first chapter, if in the second her place is taken by Eve? For many centuries, this contradiction has generated questions, speculations, and legends. And from this gap, from this textual fissure, grew one of the most mysterious figures in the entire history of religion and mythology. The name of this figure is Lilith. Here is the first puzzle of our investigation. If Lilith is a product of the imagination of medieval interpreters, why does her image coincide with demonic characters that existed in Sumer over 3,000 years before the earliest surviving text about her were written? Why does a name very close to Lilith appear in the text of the prophet Isaiah, a text from the 8th century BC? And why were protective spells against her found on household items used by perfectly ordinary people in Mesopotamia 1,500 years ago? And here is the second puzzle, perhaps even more intriguing. Over the last 2 centuries, the image of Lilith has undergone a radical transformation. The very figure that for millennia was depicted as a night demon, threatening newborns and sleeping men, has in modern culture become a symbol of independence. How did this happen? What in this image proved to be so vital that it allowed each era to mold something completely different from it? And which of the many versions of this image is closest to its historical origins? Can we even speak of a real Lilith? Or are we simply looking at a series of images that have been given the same name? Today, we will conduct an investigation spanning 5,000 years, from Sumerian cuneiform texts to medieval Jewish manuscripts, from Mesopotamian incantation bowls to the pages of the Zohar. We will examine each layer of this image separately and see how exactly one of the most enduring mythological figures in human history was formed. And we will try to answer a question that seems historical, but is actually a question about the nature of myth. Where does an image come from that outlives all the civilizations that created it? Let us begin with that contradiction in the book of Genesis that lies at the foundation of this entire story. The first chapter of the book of Genesis contains the following words: "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. There are no details about the process here. No mention of ribs, of deep sleep, of sequence. Simply, male and female he created them. Simultaneously, from the same material, in the same image. The second chapter of Genesis describes a completely different story. God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes one of his ribs, and from this rib creates a woman. Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. This woman is Eve. She is created from a part of Adam, after him, from him. This description places her in a different relationship to man than the one implied in the first chapter. Modern biblical scholarship has long noted this contradiction. In academic circles, there exists the so-called documentary hypothesis, a theory according to which the Pentateuch is a composite text compiled from several earlier sources. These sources are conventionally designated by the letters J, E, D, and P, from the initial letters of their conventional names: Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly source. Each of these sources was created at different times, in different cultural contexts, with different theological emphases. When editors compiled them into a single text, some discrepancies between the sources remained visible, including two different accounts of the creation of man. According to proponents of this theory, the first creation account, the six-day creation in the first chapter of Genesis, belongs to the priestly source and emphasizes the orderliness, symmetry, and sublimity of creation. The second account, in chapters 2 and 3, belongs to the Yahwist, an earlier tradition, and is written in a more concrete, earthy language. God fashions man from dust, plants a garden, brings animals to Adam, takes his rib. These two accounts reflect different theological emphases and possibly different cultural traditions that existed within the unified Jewish religion. The documentary hypothesis explains the technical origin of this contradiction, but it does not create Lilith. Lilith appears differently. She is born from the space between the two texts, from the question readers have asked for centuries. If in the first chapter, woman and man are created simultaneously and from the same material, and in the second chapter, woman is created later and from a part of man, then are they different women? Who was the first? And where is she now? It is precisely this question that opened the space for the legend. The textual fissure became not merely a hermeneutical problem. It became an entry point for centuries of myth-making. But to understand where the image that filled this space came from, we need to go much further back in history, to Mesopotamia, to the civilization that existed 3,000 years before the first biblical texts were written. Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, the territory of modern Iraq. Approximately the 5th to 4th millennia BC. Here arose one of the world's first written civilizations, with its own astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and rich mythology. It is here, in the Sumerian cultural tradition, that researchers trace the earliest roots of the image that would later become Lilith. In the Sumerian language, there existed the word Lilu, and this was not the name of a specific being, but a designation for an entire class of demonic spirits. The Lilu were associated with night, wind, and the air element. It was believed they caused illnesses, sent nightmares, and harmed pregnant women and newborns. The word Lilu itself has several related meanings in Sumerian: night, wind, spirit. This is not a biographical figure with a specific history. It is a category, a class of dangerous beings. The very existence of such a system speaks volumes. When a culture creates a classification of night demons, it means that the everyday fear of the night has become a subject of systematic reflection. The Sumerians did not simply fear the dark. They tried to understand what exactly hides in the dark, what its properties are, and how to interact with it. This was an early form of demonology, an attempt to create a map of the invisible world of threats. One of the oldest written sources mentioning something resembling Lilith is the Sumerian text Inanna and the Halupu tree, dated approximately to the 3rd millennium BC. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, one of the central figures of the Sumerian pantheon, finds a tree uprooted by a flood of the Euphrates and transplants it into her garden. She wants to make a throne and a bed from it, but the tree becomes a home for 3 unwanted guests. A snake settles in the roots, the bird Anzu builds a nest in the branches, and a certain being, called in the text the Dark Maiden, occupies the trunk. Researchers have long debated whether this being is a prototype of Lilith or not. There is a basis for comparison. In some translations of the Sumerian word denoting this dark maiden, the word Lilith, or Lilith, is used. However, a number of modern researchers warn such identification may be a translation error, a projection of later images onto an earlier text. Nevertheless, this episode is regularly mentioned in discussions about the origins of Lilith as a possible starting point. When the hero Gilgamesh comes to Inanna's aid, he kills the snake, drives away the bird, and then the dark maiden also leaves the tree and goes into the wilderness. Her banishment is not an execution or destruction, simply a departure. In this text, she is not yet a terrifying demon or the first wife of Adam. She is merely an unwanted inhabitant who is driven away. Note the symbolism of the tree. The three unwanted guests occupy three different parts: roots, branches, trunk. The snake below, the bird above, the dark maiden in the middle. This is the vertical structure of the universe in the image of a tree, the underworld, the sky, and the earth between them. Each of the three guests occupies its place in this cosmological scheme, and Gilgamesh, the hero of civilization, expels all three, freeing the tree for human use. This is a metaphor for establishing human order in place of natural chaos, a motif that will be repeated in the mythological traditions of many peoples. The Sumerian tradition passed to the Akkadians, who inherited most of Sumerian culture and mythology, including its demonology. Akkadian texts contain mentions of beings of the Lilith class, spirits of night and wind, who were feared and against whom protective formulas were composed. This transition from Sumerian to Akkadian culture itself demonstrates the mechanism that will work throughout the history of the image. Demonic images pass from one civilization to another, integrating into new cultural systems and acquiring new features while retaining key elements of their identity. From Mesopotamia, this image gradually spread to other cultural traditions of the Near East through trade connections, diplomatic contacts, and migrations of peoples. It is here that it will come into contact with the Jewish religious tradition. But this contact will be cautious and ambiguous. The Jewish tradition does not simply borrow the image, it filters it through its monotheistic system, integrating it under special conditions. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, mentions something that may be connected to Lilith only once. This is one verse from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14. In the original ancient Hebrew text, the word Lilith appears there, used alongside other nocturnal creatures inhabiting the desolate land. The context of this passage is important. The 34th chapter of Isaiah is a prophecy of judgment against Edom, a people hostile to Israel. The land over which this judgment has passed turns into a scorched wasteland. It will burn, and its smoke will rise forever. Generation after generation, the land will lie desolate. And what exactly inhabits this desolation? The prophet lists. The desert owl and the screech owl will possess it. The owl and the raven will dwell there. The measuring line of chaos will be stretched over it. Jackals and ostriches, night creatures, and among these beings, Lilith. This is an image of desolation through its specific inhabitants. The principle here is the same as in any landscape description in ancient poetry. The destruction of the human world means the return of wild, nocturnal, dangerous creatures. The wilderness is not simply the absence of people. It is a space where something else, hostile and dark, holds sway. In the translation of the Synodal Bible, this word is rendered as night specter. The ancient Greek version of the Bible, the Septuagint, translates it with the word onocentaur, literally, a creature with the body of a donkey. The Latin Vulgate renders it as lamia, the name of a Greek demon. In a number of modern translations, the word is transliterated directly, Lilith, without translation. One English translation uses screech owl, another night monster. This diversity in translations is itself telling. Translators of different eras could not agree on what exactly this word denotes, because its meaning in the ancient Hebrew text was already ambiguous for their contemporaries. Is it the name of a specific demonic figure, a designation for a class of nocturnal beings, a poetic term for a night bird? None of these interpretations is indisputable. What is important to note here, even if we accept that this verse from Isaiah indeed mentions that very Lilith, she appears in it not as Adam's first wife, and not as a demon with a specific biography. She is one of the nocturnal creatures inhabiting the desert. This is an image of night, danger, desolation, nothing more. The next chronological documentary source associated with the image of Lilith is the texts from Qumran, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They date to approximately the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. One of the texts, called the Hymn of the Sage, or Song of the Sage, describes various evil spirits and demons against which the narrator directs his words. Among these beings is Lilith. Here she is already included in a specific demonological list, standing alongside other malevolent spirits. It is important to understand what the Qumran texts represented. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in caves near Qumran, on the shore of the Dead Sea. This was one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. The texts were written by a Jewish community, presumably the Essenes, and spanned a period from approximately the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. They showed us a cross-section of Jewish religious life in the era between the Old and New Testaments, a period whose documentation had previously been relatively scarce. The fact that Lilith appears in the Qumran texts as a named demon, integrated into a system that opposes her with an incantation, is important evidence. It shows that by the era immediately preceding the Christian one, the image of Lilith was already part of living Jewish religious practice. Not just the nocturnal bird of Isaiah, but an active, named, dangerous character that one needed to know how to deal with. A fragment of this text reads, "And I, the teacher, proclaim the greatness of his beauty, to terrify and frighten all the spirits of the angels of destruction, the spirits of the unclean, the demons, Lilith, the howlers, and the screechers." This list shows that by the time the Qumran texts were created, Lilith was already integrated into Jewish demonology as a specific figure, not just a nocturnal bird, and not just an atmospheric image, but a named demon occupying a certain place in the hierarchy of evil beings. Parallel to this, a practice developed in Jewish tradition that eloquently testifies to how real the fear of Lilith was in everyday life. These are amulets and incantation bowls. Incantation bowls were widespread in Mesopotamia during the period from approximately the 5th to the 7th-8th centuries CE. These are ceramic bowls with inscriptions in Aramaic. The inscriptions contained incantations intended to protect the house and its inhabitants from demons, and first and foremost, from Lilith. The bowls were buried upside down under the threshold of a house or in its corners. It was assumed that in this way evil spirits would be trapped in the bowl and could not harm those living in the house. The texts on the bowls were typically addressed to specific demons by name and contained formulas of exorcism. Some of them include biographical details about Lilith, for example, mentioning her connection to children and pregnant women. The existence of these objects is valuable evidence, It shows that the image of Lilith was not merely a literary or theological abstraction. It lived in the practical religiosity of ordinary people who felt sufficiently vulnerable before this being to resort to magical means of protection. This is not an academic discussion. This is fear that became part of daily life. The Babylonian Talmud, whose compilation was completed around the 6th, 7th centuries CE, contains several mentions of Lilith. They are scattered across different tractates and do not form a single coherent narrative, but together they create a fairly clear image. Tractate Shabbat 151b states, "It is forbidden for a man to sleep alone in a house, otherwise Lilith will take possession of him." This is a warning about a specific danger: loneliness, vulnerability, night, and Lilith, who exploits this weakness. In Tractate Niddah 24b, Lilith is described as a female being with wings. Tractate Eruvin mentions her hair, long, loose. This image, a winged woman with long, loose hair, would become a stable iconographic template in later tradition. It is important to understand what lies behind these brief mentions. The Talmud is not a literary collection or a theological treatise in the modern sense. It is primarily a legal and narrative document, recording the discussions and decisions of rabbinical academies. When Lilith appears in the Talmud, it means that the rabbis deemed it necessary to record practical recommendations related to the threat she represents. This is not a decorative element. It is a real pastoral instruction for real people. The Talmudic mentions are important because they show the image of Lilith was not a marginal superstition. It was present in the authoritative corpus of Jewish legal and religious literature. This does not mean that Lilith was perceived as a central theological character, but she was a sufficiently real element of religious imagination to make it onto the pages of the Talmud. What exactly does Lilith do in the Talmudic sources? Primarily, she threatens men sleeping alone and is dangerous to newborns. These are the two main categories of her actions. Both are related to vulnerability. A sleeping person is helpless. A newborn is helpless. Lilith is perceived as a force acting where a person is deprived of ordinary protection. This distinction between vulnerable and protected situations had practical significance. It suggested to people when exactly they needed to be especially careful. Do not go to sleep alone in an empty house. Protect a newborn with an amulet. Recite the appropriate prayer before sleep. Demonology in this case functioned not as abstract theology, but as a practical guide to risk management. Lilith was named, her methods were described, and thereby an illusion of control over unpredictable misfortunes was created. Here it is time to pause in the middle of our investigation, to draw an interim summary and look at the overall picture. So, what do we have by the turn of the first millennium CE? The image of Lilith was built on several layers that were superimposed on each other over millennia. The first layer is Sumerian, a class of nocturnal Lilu demons associated with night, wind, and illness. The second layer is the solitary mention in the text of Isaiah, which various interpreters read differently, as a proper name, as the name of a class of beings, as a poetic image, as the name of a bird. The third layer is the Qumran text, where she already stands in a row of named demons. The fourth layer is practical demonology, incantation bowls, amulets, household talismans. The fifth layer is the Talmudic mentions, which integrated her into the authoritative corpus of Jewish literature. Note a fundamental thing. In none of these sources is Lilith Adam's first wife, not in the Sumerian text, not in Isaiah, not in Qumran, not in the Talmud. The story that she was Adam's wife before Eve has not yet been written. It would appear only in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a text compiled approximately in the 7th to 10th centuries CE. This means that the most popular version of Lilith's story, the one most people have heard, is relatively late. It is thousands of years younger than the image from which it grew. But let's return to the incantation bowls, this phenomenon that deserves more detailed consideration. Hundreds of such bowls have been found during archaeological excavations in the territory of modern Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Most of them date to the period from approximately the 5th to the 8th centuries CE. They come from a wide variety of contexts, from house ruins, from graves, from refuse pits. They are found where ordinary people lived. The inscriptions on the bowls were made in the Aramaic language, the spoken language of Jewish and other communities in the Near East at that time. They contained incantations directed against specific demons. Many of them are addressed directly to Lilith, sometimes naming her by name, sometimes describing her as Lilith who harms men, or Lilith who kills newborns. Interestingly, some bowls contain not just incantations, but also a kind of contract with Lilith, similar to what is described in the Alphabet of Ben Sira. In them, Lilith is formally bound and obligated not to harm the inhabitants of that house. Some texts include lengthy descriptions of Lilith, her appearance, her actions, her weaknesses. These are not just utilitarian protective formulas. They are evidence that the image of Lilith was alive, concrete, and detailed in people's imagination. The incantation bowls reveal to us a religious life not always reflected in official literature. This is not what rabbis discussed in academies. This is what real families buried under the threshold of their house to protect their children. This is folk belief, practical magic, fear of the night, expressed in a specific ritual action. And this fear was directed primarily against Lilith. The most detailed and most influential narrative about Lilith as Adam's first wife is contained in the medieval Jewish text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira. It dates to approximately the 7th to 10th centuries CE. The exact date is unknown, and debates continue among scholars. The text's title refers to the sage Ben Sira, who lived in the 2nd century BCE and wrote the book of Sirach, one of the so-called deuterocanonical books. However, the Alphabet of Ben Sira is a much later work that merely attributes its stories to the tradition of this sage. This is one of the strangest texts of medieval Jewish literature, a collection of discourses, anecdotes, and stories framed as a dialogue between a wise child, the son of Ben Sira himself, and King Nebuchadnezzar. The text has an ironic, sarcastic tone, which has led a number of researchers to believe that it is, in a sense, a parodic or didactic work, not a pious treatise. Some scholars view it as an early medieval example of Jewish folk creativity with a lightly ironic attitude towards serious religious themes. It is in the Alphabet of Ben Sira that the first detailed narrative appears, stating that Lilith was created simultaneously with Adam, from the same earth as he. And it is here that the conflict between them is first described in detail. The essence of the conflict, as presented in the text, is as follows. Lilith and Adam were created simultaneously from the same material, earth. This implied their equality. However, a dispute arose between them about which of them should occupy the lower position during marital relations. Adam insisted that it was Lilith who should submit. Lilith refused, pointing out that they were equal in origin. She said, "Why should I lie beneath? For we are both equal, for we are both created from dust." Adam did not agree. The dispute reached an impasse. Then Lilith uttered the secret name of God. In Jewish tradition, this was perceived as a supernatural act granting special power, and flew away from Eden. Uttering the unutterable name of God was an act of particular significance in Jewish tradition. It violated a most important religious taboo, and simultaneously opened access to supernatural power. It was through this action that Lilith left paradise. God sent 3 angels after her, Senoi, Sansanoi, and Semangaloth. They found her by the Red Sea and demanded her return. She refused. The angels threatened punishment. Hundreds of her children would die every day. Lilith agreed to a compromise. She would not harm children if amulets with the names of these 3 angels were near them. According to another version of the same text, her agreement with the angels also applies to boys up to the 8th day of life, and girls up to the 20th day. Note the specific way this narrative is constructed. Lilith did not submit. She left. She was not defeated. She made a pact. This is not a story about the destruction of evil, but a story about its limitation and control. This is precisely why this narrative proved functionally useful for the religious tradition. It did not merely describe a danger, but also pointed to a way to protect oneself from it. Amulets bearing the names of the 3 angels, Senoi, Sansanoi, and Semangaloth, genuinely existed in Jewish tradition. They were used to protect newborns and women in childbirth. The account in the Alphabet of Ben Sira provided a mythological foundation for this practice. The story of Lilith explained why this specific incantation with these specific names in this specific context was necessary. Myth and ritual were directly linked. A number of scholars note the provocative nature of this text. Some believe the Alphabet of Ben Sira was not written as a pious instruction, but rather represented a kind of parody or critique of the social norms contemporary to its author. If so, then the story of Lilith within it can be read as a commentary on relations between the sexes, but such an interpretation remains debated and is not universally accepted in academic literature. After the Alphabet of Ben Sira, the image of Lilith begins to develop in the direction of Cabalistic mysticism. Kabbalah, a system of Jewish mysticism actively developed in the Middle Ages, created a new place for Lilith in the spiritual cosmos. The most important Kabbalistic text, the Zohar, written in Spain in the 13th century and traditionally attributed to the sage Shimon bar Yochai, although most modern scholars believe it was compiled by the Spanish mystic Moses de Leon, repeatedly mentions Lilith and gives her image an entirely new dimension. The Zohar is one of the central texts of Jewish mysticism. It develops a complex system for understanding God, the universe, and humanity through the concept of the Sephirot, 10 vessels or attributes of God from which the spiritual world is constructed. In this system, every aspect of reality has its mystical correspondence. Evil, in particular, is understood not as an independent force equal to God, but as a parasitic dark side of reality. The kelipot, shells, that surround and conceal the divine light. In this system, Lilith occupies a special place. She is described as a being standing at the head of demonic forces, particularly those that threaten people at night and harm children. In several places in the Zohar, she is presented as the wife of Samael, a demonic being embodying the principle of evil. This union is described as a dark parody or antithesis of the union between masculine and feminine principles in the divine world. It is important to understand what this place meant within the Cabalistic system. Here, Lilith became not merely an evil spirit attacking people. She transformed into the personification of a specific metaphysical principle, the principle of chaotic, destructive femininity, opposing the divine order. She was understood as the dark counterpart of the Shekinah, the divine presence, which in Kabbalah has feminine traits. This elevation of Lilith to the level of a cosmological symbol meant that her image now carried a significantly greater semantic load than simply a dangerous night demon. She became the embodiment of a specific understanding of evil, disorder, and darkness, an evil that is not independent, but which in the Kabbalistic system has a certain role in the spiritual structure of the universe. The Zohar also develops the idea that Lilith acts primarily through seduction. She appears to men in dreams, leads them into temptation, steals their seed from which she gives birth to demonic children. This motif is connected to broader ideas about nightmares and involuntary nocturnal emissions, which in traditional cultures were often attributed to demonic intervention. The Kabbalistic Lilith is thus the result of a long and multi-stage process of transforming the image, from a night wind spirit to a named demon, from a named demon to a biographical character, and finally to a symbol within a complex mystical system. Each of these steps added new layers of meaning to the image without canceling the previous ones. The connection between Lilith and the image of the owl in various cultural traditions deserves special attention. The name Lilith itself, or more precisely its possible etymological roots, is often linked to the night and images of nocturnal birds. The ancient Hebrew Layla means night. The root Lil is present in a Sumerian word denoting a night demon. This etymological link, albeit ambiguous, runs throughout the history of the image. In the Russian synodal translation of the Bible, the passage from Isaiah containing the word Lilith is translated as nocturnal apparition. In some English translations, it is rendered as screech owl. The Latin Vulgate uses the word lamia, a Greek name for a night demon, also associated with child abduction. This shows that the connection Lilith, nocturnal bird, night demon, existed in different languages and traditions as a stable semantic node. In many cultures of the Near East, owls were considered ominous birds. Their nocturnal lifestyle, their motionless gaze, their ability to see in the dark, their cry in the night, all this made them natural symbols of the dark and supernatural. An owl crying in the night was perceived as a sign of approaching death or as a creature bearing a message from the world of the dead. It was this cultural association that organically and convincingly linked the image of Lilith with owls. One of the most famous depictions that some scholars associate with Lilith is the so-called Burney relief, a small terracotta relief from southern Mesopotamia dating approximately to the 19th, 18th centuries BCE. It depicts a winged female figure with the claws of an owl or bird of prey instead of feet, standing on two owls. The relief is striking in its detail and artistic perfection. However, the academic community has not reached a consensus regarding who exactly this relief depicts. A number of scholars believed it to be Lilith. Others identified the figure as the goddess Inanna or Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. Still others believed it to be a local deity unknown to us. The debate is not settled, and any definitive claim that the Burney relief depicts Lilith should be treated with caution. Nevertheless, even if this depiction is not a, quote, portrait of Lilith in the strict sense, It reflects a culture in which the image of a winged, nocturnal female demon with bird claws standing on owls was understandable and meaningful. This is the same cultural environment from which the Sumerian Lilith demons emerged. And it is this visual image, wings, claws, owls, night, that would become a stable iconographic template for depictions of Lilith in later times. In medieval Jewish art and subsequent Western iconography, Lilith is depicted with wings and bird claws, often surrounded by owls or standing on owls. This visual image reproduces the logic laid down in Sumerian culture. Nocturnal bird, nocturnal demon, dark-winged woman. All are variants of a single archetypal image linking femininity with nocturnal danger. Now let us focus on the question that lies at the heart of this entire story. What exactly in this image proved to be so enduring? Lilith has traversed a path of 5,000 years, from Sumerian wind demon spirits to modern culture. Along this path, the image repeatedly changed form, from an unnamed class of beings to a specific demon, from a demon to a character with a biography, from a biographical character to a Cabalistic symbol, from a Cabalistic symbol to an emblem of independence. And in each of these forms, it proved to be alive and relevant for its audience. One answer to the question of this image's endurance is the following. Lilith embodies specific, very human fears. The fear of night, universal and ancient. The fear for the lives of newborns, no less universal. The fear for the vulnerability of a sleeping person when consciousness is switched off and the body is helpless. All these fears are real, and they existed in all cultures and eras. An image that personifies these fears gives them a name and a form, and thereby makes them slightly more manageable. This is one of the fundamental mechanisms of mythological thinking, to give fear a name. One can write a spell against Lilith. One cannot write a spell against infant death in general. By naming the threat, one can try to negotiate with it, or drive it away, or at least feel that one has done something. Lilith gave people that opportunity. Another answer is connected to the specific role Lilith assumed in the Alphabet of Ben Sira. She is a being that left of its own accord, not exiled for a specific sin, not defeated, simply left because it refused to submit. This endows her with a special quality that most demonic characters lack. She has motives that can be understood. She is not simply evil without explanation. She is a response to a specific conflict. It is precisely this quality that made the image of Lilith convenient material for various reinterpretations. In different eras, different cultural traditions projected their own conflicts and anxieties onto it. For medieval authors, the threat to family and children. For Kabbalists, a symbol of chaotic forces. For modern culture, an image of independence. The same image, but each time filled with the content of its era. There is another aspect that explains the image's longevity. The story of Lilith is connected to one of the most fundamental human questions, the question of the nature of evil and its origin. If God created a good world, where does evil come from? Where do diseases, infant mortality, nocturnal horrors come from? Lilith provided an answer to this question that did not require directly blaming God. Evil came through a being that itself chose to leave, itself chose the dark path. This resolved the theological problem while simultaneously providing an image of a specific source of misfortune. This mechanism is not unique to Lilith. It works in the demonology of any culture.
But in the case of Lilith, it is reinforced by biographical specificity. She has a history, a name, motives.
She is not just a dark force. She is a character with a past. And it is precisely this that made her image especially convincing and especially long-lived. In the 20th century, primarily in Western cultural space, the image of Lilith underwent a radical reinterpretation. Some feminist movements turned to it as a symbol of independence and refusal to submit. From this perspective, Lilith's departure from Eden is read not as a sin or a demonic fall, but as an act of self-determination. The story of Adam's first wife, who left because she disagreed with unequal relations, became in this reading a story about the right to dignity. This reinterpretation gained wide cultural dissemination in the last decades of the 20th century. Lilith began to appear in fiction, music, visual art, but no longer as a threat, but as an image of strength. In 1997, the Lilith Fair Music Festival, featuring female performers, launched in the USA. The name itself was chosen deliberately. Lilith as a symbol of female independence and solidarity. In various currents of contemporary spirituality and neo-paganism, Lilith is also present as a figure associated with female power and liberation. The name Lilith as a personal female name appears in Western countries precisely in this period, which is telling in itself. In cultures where for many centuries this name was associated with a demon, parents began giving it to their daughters. This radical change is evidence of how completely the image was reinterpreted. Researchers analyzing this modern interpretation note that it relies on real elements from the medieval version of the story. Lilith did indeed leave of her own accord, and she did indeed cite the equality of her origin. However, this modern reinterpretation completely shifts the emphases present in the original text. The Alphabet of Ben Sira perceived Lilith's departure as a fall and a source of evil, precisely why she becomes a demon who kills children. The modern reading sees in that same departure a liberation, and completely ignores the demonological part of the story. This does not mean the modern reading is incorrect in some absolute sense. It means it is an interpretation, in the same way that each previous version of the figure was an interpretation. The Sumerians interpreted nocturnal dangers through the figure of the Lilu. Medieval authors interpreted a biblical contradiction through the figure of the defiant first wife. Cabalists interpreted the nature of evil through the figure of Lilith as a klippah. Modern culture interprets questions of power and gender through the figure of Lilith, the rebel. Each of these readings was real for its audience. None of them is neutral or ahistorical, and together they constitute the long history of the figure that we have traced in our investigation. So, what then can be said about the origins of Lilith, if that is the question of our investigation? First, the figure we today call Lilith is composite. It was assembled over millennia from different cultural sources. The Sumerian tradition provided a class of nocturnal demons with a name similar to Lilith. The single mention in the text of Isaiah provided the basis for including this name in the Hebrew tradition. The Qumran texts included her in a demonological list. The Talmud introduced her into the authoritative corpus of Jewish religious literature. The Alphabet of Ben Sira created her biography. Kabbalah integrated her into a cosmological system. Second, at each stage of this journey, the figure changed, not by accident, but in accordance with the cultural needs of the audience for which it was created. Fear of nocturnal illnesses in Sumer, fear for newborn children in late antique Judaism. The search for a systemic explanation of evil in Kabbalah. Third, what appears to be a single character with a long history, upon closer examination, turns out to be a series of figures connected by a common name, but not necessarily by a common essence. The Lilith of Sumerian texts and the Lilith of the Zohar are separated not only by time, but by a fundamental difference in function, meaning, and context. This in itself is an important lesson, not only about Lilith, but about the nature of mythological figures in general. They are not born once and for all in one place. They are formed gradually, from many sources, in response to changing human needs. And they continue to change as long as the cultural tradition that carries them remains alive. Let us summarize our investigation. The history of the figure of Lilith begins presumably in Sumer, in a class of nocturnal demonic beings associated with wind, night, and illness. This very association reflected a very concrete experience: nocturnal dangers, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, especially of children. The name of this class of demons, Lilu, may have become the basis for the later figure. A possible trace of this figure is preserved in a single verse of the book of Isaiah, where the word Lilith stands in a row of nocturnal creatures inhabiting a desolate land. Different translators have read this word differently, which indicates that its precise meaning was already not entirely clear at that time. In the Qumran texts, Lilith appears as a named demon included in a list of evil spirits. In the Babylonian Talmud, she warns of danger for sleeping solitary men and for newborns. Incantation bowls from Mesopotamia testify that the fear of her lived in the everyday experience of ordinary people, not as an abstract theological category, but as a real threat combated with specific ritual means. The first detailed biographical narrative about Lilith as the first wife of Adam is contained in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a text dated approximately to the 7th to 10th centuries CE. It is here that the story appears of Lilith's creation from the same earth as Adam, her conflict with Adam over equality, the utterance of God's secret name, the flight from Eden, and the pact with the three angels. This narrative was functionally linked to real religious practice, the use of amulets with the names of the three angels to protect newborns. In Cabalistic texts, primarily in the Zohar of the 13th century, Lilith gains a place in mystical cosmology as a symbol of chaotic forces opposing the divine order. She becomes part of a broader system describing the nature of evil and acquires features that extend far beyond simple demonology. In modern culture, the figure of Lilith undergoes a reinterpretation that shifts the emphases laid down in medieval sources. This phenomenon is interesting in itself as an example of how mythological figures continue to live and change in the modern world. The main conclusion of our investigation is as follows. The figure we call Lilith is not a single homogeneous character that has existed since the beginning of time. It is a series of different figures that receive the same name, or similar names, in different cultural traditions at different times. The Sumerian Lilu, the biblical Lilith in Isaiah, the Qumran Lilith, the Talmudic Lilith, the medieval first wife of Adam, the Cabalistic symbol of chaos. These are different figures, connected by certain common elements, but not identical to each other. The question of the real Lilith, of which of these figures is the original and authentic one, is in this sense incorrect. There is no one real Lilith hidden behind all these layers. There is a series of cultural constructs, each of which was real for its audience and its time. What then explains the endurance of this figure across millennia? Why did it not disappear, as many other mythological figures have? The answer, it seems, is connected to the fact that this figure touched upon something fundamentally human. Fear of the night, fear of children's death, anxiety about the unknown hidden in the darkness. These are not historical fears. They are human fears that have always existed and exist now. A figure that personifies these fears and gives them a name gains a chance at a long life. There is another aspect that is important to mention. The history of Lilith unfolded at the intersection of several different cultures: Sumerian, Akkadian, Jewish, Aramaic, medieval European. Each of these cultural contexts gave the figure something of its own. The Sumerians gave it roots in the most ancient layer of human demonology. The Jewish tradition gave it a connection to the biblical text, and thus to the billions of readers who have read the Bible over millennia. Medieval Kabbalah gave it a place in systematic religious philosophy. Each of these contributions was necessary for the figure to survive to our day. This reminds us that culture never creates its figures in isolation. Myths travel. They cross borders with merchants, soldiers, refugees, translators. They change along the way, but are not lost. The history of Lilith is the story of how a figure traveled from Sumer across the entire Mediterranean and the Near East, changed languages and contexts, accumulated new meanings, and yet remained recognizable. Furthermore, the story of Lilith in the Alphabet of Ben Sira added a special quality to this figure. She has motives that can be understood. She left not out of malice and not because she was defeated. She left because she disagreed. This makes her figure more complex than that of an ordinary demon, and it is precisely this complexity that has allowed different eras to find different meanings in it. Ultimately, the history of Lilith is the story of how humanity creates figures for its fears and its questions. Figures that outlive the civilizations that created them, that change without dying, that in every era speak to people in their own language, though the name remains the same. This is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule itself. The most enduring mythological figures possess precisely this flexibility, this ability to contain new content without losing recognizability. The riddle with which we began, who was the woman mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis, if the woman of the second chapter is Eve, remains open from a text-critical perspective. Most modern biblical scholars explain this apparent contradiction as the merging of different literary sources during the creation of the Pentateuch text, not the presence of two different women. But it is precisely this contradiction, this blank space in the text, that gave life to a figure that proved to be remarkably tenacious. A textual gap became a portal, and through it, Lilith entered history. 5,000 years. From Sumerian nocturnal spirits to Mesopotamian incantation bowls. From a single verse in the book of Isaiah to a detailed narrative in medieval Jewish literature. From Cabalistic cosmology to modern culture. Throughout this entire journey, the figure of Lilith remained alive because it touched upon something enduring in human experience: the fear of night, the mystery of death, questions about what is hidden in the darkness beyond the threshold of the home. Different eras gave different answers, using the same figure. And in this lies the nature of an enduring myth. The name remains. The story continues.